My name is Michael. I had a steady career, a beautiful wife, and a best friend I could count on like a brother. Funny how life has a way of flipping the script when you least expect it. Andrew and I met when we were kids. He was the kind of guy who could walk into a room and immediately own it. Charisma just oozed out of him effortlessly. Me? I've always been the quieter one, the guy in the background. But that worked for us. He had the spotlight, and I was fine holding the camera. Over the years, we shared everything: inside jokes, embarrassing secrets, and countless beers on countless nights. He wasn't just my best friend, he was family. Then there was Mary. The day I met her felt like something out of a cheesy romance movie. She walked into my life with that bright smile, like she already knew we were destined to be together. And for a while, it really felt that way. We clicked on every level. Our conversations flowed, our goals aligned, and even our silences were comfortable. When I proposed, Andrew was the first person I told. He hugged me like a proud older brother and promised to have my back forever. The first few years of marriage were good. Not perfect, nothing ever is, but good. Then things began to shift, slowly, almost imperceptibly. Mary started staying out later than usual, her laughter no longer lighting up our house the way it used to. At first, I told myself it was work stress, or maybe the natural ebb and flow of relationships. I didn't think much of it until Andrew began showing up more than usual, stopping by unannounced, lingering a little too long. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to Andrew being Andrew. He always had a knack for worming his way into people's lives, but this time it felt different. There was a tension in the air, subtle but persistent. Mary seemed happier when he was around, and when he wasn't, her mood would plummet. I started questioning things, but doubt has a way of making you second-guess yourself. Looking back, there were signs, small cracks in the foundation I chose to ignore. A shared look between them that lingered a second too long. Inside jokes I wasn't part of. Excuses that didn't quite add up. But denial is a powerful thing. I wanted to believe in my wife, in my best friend, in the life we'd built together. For a long time, I thought I was imagining it, that my insecurities were playing tricks on me. Andrew was my friend, my brother. Mary was my wife, my partner. The idea that either of them could betray me felt absurd, impossible even. But as I would eventually learn, trust isn't a shield, it's a blindfold, and mine kept me from seeing the storm that had been brewing right in front of me. I still remember the night everything came crashing down. It was one of those evenings when the world seems to slow down, almost like it's holding its breath for what's about to happen. Mary had gone to bed early, too early for someone who usually stayed up scrolling through her phone or binge-watching her favorite shows. That should have been my first clue, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I was in the living room, sipping on what would turn out to be the most bitter glass of whiskey I'd ever had, when her phone buzzed on the coffee table. Normally, I wouldn't have looked. I wasn't the type to snoop. Trust was a cornerstone of our relationship. Or so I thought. But this time, something made me pick it up. Call it intuition or sheer stupidity, but I looked. The message was from Andrew. At first glance, it seemed harmless. "Good night, love. Can't wait to see you tomorrow." But the word love hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind raced to rationalize it. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe I was reading too much into it. But then I scrolled up, and the truth hit me like a freight train. The thread of messages between them stretched back for months. Flirty exchanges, intimate confessions, and plans that made it clear this wasn't just a casual flirtation. It was a full-blown affair. I sat there scrolling through their conversations, feeling like the walls were closing in. There were messages mocking me, too. "He's so clueless," one read, followed by a laughing emoji from Mary. Another from Andrew said, "I don't know how you put up with him." And then Mary's response, "I don't even know anymore, but soon it'll just be us." I wanted to vomit. The woman I loved, the person I had vowed to spend my life with, and my best friend, the one I trusted more than anyone, had conspired to rip my world apart. I don't know how long I sat there staring at the screen, my hands trembling with a mix of rage and heartbreak. Eventually, I stood up and went to our bedroom. Mary was asleep, her face peaceful as if she hadn't just shattered everything we'd built together. "Mary," I said, my voice shaking. She stirred and opened her eyes, blinking at me like she couldn't understand why I was there. "What's this?" I asked, holding up her phone. Her face froze, a mix of shock and guilt flashing across her features. For a split second, she tried to play dumb, but when I started reading the messages aloud, her defenses crumbled. She didn't deny it. She didn't even try. Instead, she sat up, folded her arms, and said, "What do you want me to say, Michael? It happened. I'm not happy, and Andrew makes me feel alive. Alive." That word cut deeper than anything else she could have said. I asked her why. Why him? Why my best friend? She shrugged, as if the answer didn't matter, as if my pain was a trivial detail in her story. The next day, I confronted Andrew. I don't know what I expected. An apology, maybe, or at least some semblance of shame. But he just smirked, leaned back in his chair and said, "Look, man, I didn't mean for it to happen, but maybe you should have treated her better." I wanted to hit him. I came so close, my fists clenched at my sides. But I walked away. Violence wouldn't solve anything, and deep down, I knew it wouldn't make me feel better. That was the moment I realized I had lost them both, my wife and my best friend. The betrayal wasn't just in their actions. It was in their indifference, their complete lack of remorse. They didn't care about what they had done to me, and that was the hardest pill to swallow. I spent the next few weeks in a daze, going through the motions of life but feeling like a hollow version of myself. Everywhere I turned, I saw reminders of them, photos, memories, and echoes of a life that no longer existed. But as much as it hurt, something inside me refused to let them win. They had taken my trust, my happiness, and my peace, but they weren't going to take my dignity. That's when I decided that if they wanted to play games, I'd make sure the next move was mine. And this time, it would be checkmate. You'd think betrayal would come with a clean break, like ripping off a bandage. But no. Betrayal lingers. It festers. It replays in your mind like a bad movie you can't turn off. And just when you think you've seen the worst of it, life decides to throw another punch. For me, that punch came in the form of a cream-colored envelope. It arrived on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday. The kind of day where the world feels indifferent to whatever storm is raging inside you. I was sorting through my mail, bills, junk, the usual, when I saw it. My name was scrawled across the front in Andrew's unmistakable handwriting. At first, I thought it was some sort of sick joke. I stood there, staring at it, my heart pounding in my chest. Part of me didn't want to open it. But curiosity, or maybe masochism, got the better of me. Inside was an invitation to their wedding. Andrew and Mary. Together. Officially. The audacity of it was almost impressive. The text was printed on expensive cardstock, the kind that screamed, "We're doing just fine without you." It was all there. The date, the venue, even a note saying how much they'd love to have me there. For a moment, I thought about tearing it up, throwing it in the trash where it belonged. But then I realized something. This wasn't just an invitation. It was an opportunity. An opportunity to face them, to remind them that I wasn't the broken man they'd left behind. And maybe, just maybe, it was an opportunity for something more. The decision to attend wasn't easy. My first instinct was to decline, to let them think I couldn't handle seeing them together. But that wasn't true. I could handle it. What I couldn't handle was letting them think they'd beaten me. Over the next few days, I made a plan. Not a revenge plot exactly, at least not yet, but a way to reclaim some semblance of control. I reached out to a private investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Rachel who came highly recommended. If Andrew and Mary wanted to flaunt their happiness, I was going to make sure their foundation wasn't as solid as it appeared. Rachel was thorough. Within a week, she'd dug up enough dirt on Andrew to make a landfill look clean. There were whispers of shady business deals, questionable tax filings, and more than a few skeletons in his closet. One particularly juicy tidbit involved an embezzlement case from his previous job, a crime he somehow managed to sweep under the rug. But the pièce de résistance came from an IT specialist I hired, a guy who could hack into the Pentagon if you gave him enough caffeine. He uncovered financial records that linked Andrew to some serious fraud. This wasn't just petty stuff. This was the kind of thing that could land someone in prison for a long time. With this new arsenal of information, I felt a strange sense of calm. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice. Andrew and Mary had built their happiness on the ruins of my life, and if they thought I was going to stand by and let them get away with it, they were sorely mistaken. The weeks leading up to the wedding were surreal. I went through the motions of life, all the while carrying this secret weapon in my back pocket. People who knew me, friends, co-workers, kept asking if I was okay. I'd smile, shrug, and tell them I was fine. The day of the wedding arrived faster than I expected. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing a suit that was sharp but understated. I wasn't there to make a scene. I was there to observe, to wait, and to act when the time was right. Walking into the venue felt like stepping into a lion's den. The room was full of familiar faces, people who had known Andrew and me since we were kids. They greeted me with polite smiles, some with awkward pats on the back, as if they didn't know how to handle my presence. And then I saw them, Andrew and Mary. They were standing near the front, greeting guests, their smiles as bright as the sunlight streaming through the windows. For a moment, I felt a pang of something. Loss, maybe, or the ghost of what could have been. But then I remembered the messages, the lies, and the way they'd looked down on me like I was nothing. Andrew spotted me first. His face lit up with that infuriating smirk of his, the one that always made him look like he was in on a joke no one else understood. He raised his glass in a mock salute, and I felt my fists clench at my sides. "Michael," he said, striding over with Mary in tow, "you actually came." "Wouldn't miss it," I replied, forcing a smile. Mary's gaze flickered with something. Guilt, maybe, or fear. It didn't matter. I wasn't here for her. I was here to remind both of them that actions have consequences, and theirs were about to catch up with them in ways they couldn't even imagine. As I stood there, shaking Andrew's hand and exchanging meaningless pleasantries, I felt a strange sense of calm. The game had started, and I was no longer the pawn. This time, I was the one holding the pieces. If there's one thing Andrew has always loved, it's an audience. He thrives on attention, on being the center of every room he walks into. So when it came time for the wedding toasts, I knew he wouldn't let the opportunity slip by without turning it into a performance. What I didn't expect was how far he'd take it, and how much satisfaction he'd find in twisting the knife. The reception hall was buzzing with laughter and clinking glasses as the guests settled in for the speeches. I sat at a table near the back, doing my best to blend into the background. The last thing I wanted was to be noticed, especially by Andrew or Mary. But when Andrew stood up, microphone in hand, and cleared his throat, I knew I was about to be dragged into the spotlight whether I liked it or not. He started innocently enough, thanking everyone for being there, making a few jokes about his nerves, and telling the story of how he and Mary met. The crowd ate it up, laughing and applauding at all the right moments. I could feel the tension in my chest easing slightly, thinking maybe, just maybe, he'd stick to the script. But then he glanced in my direction. That smirk of his crept across his face, and I knew the gloves were about to come off. "You know," he said, his voice carrying through the hall, "when I first met Mary, I thought, wow, what an amazing woman. Of course, back then she was married to someone else. Someone who, how should I put this, didn't quite know what he had. The room went silent. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd, but most people just stared at him, unsure if they'd heard him correctly. "Don't get me wrong," he continued, pacing the floor like a stand-up comedian working the room. "Michael's a great guy, salt of the earth, but, well, let's just say some men are better suited as placeholders." Laughter erupted, hesitant at first, then growing louder as people caught on to the joke. I sat there, my face burning, every muscle in my body screaming at me to get up and leave. But I didn't move. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Andrew wasn't done. "And hey, credit where it's due," he added, raising his glass. "If it weren't for Michael, I wouldn't have had the chance to meet the love of my life. So here's to second chances, and knowing when it's time to step aside." The room erupted in applause. Even Mary, sitting at his side, laughed along with the crowd, though her expression seemed strained, like she wasn't entirely comfortable with how far he was pushing it. I forced a smile, clenching my jaw so tightly it felt like my teeth might shatter. My hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white, as I fought the urge to storm out. Or worse, to walk up there and knock that smug grin off his face. But no, that wasn't who I was, and it wasn't how I wanted this to play out. Let him have his moment. Let him bask in the glow of his cruelty. He thought he was untouchable, that he'd won. He didn't know that the walls were already closing in around him. When the toast finally ended, Andrew took a theatrical bow, soaking up the applause like he was on stage at some grand performance. As he returned to his seat, he caught my eye and winked. It wasn't a friendly gesture. It was a taunt, a reminder of how far he thought he'd come at my expense. I stayed seated, my expression neutral, giving nothing away. Inside, though, I was already counting down the minutes. His arrogance, his smugness, his cruelty. It was all about to come crashing down. He just didn't know it yet. I realized something about Andrew that I should have seen years ago. He never just takes what he wants. He destroys everything in his path while he's at it. It wasn't enough for him to steal Mary. He had to humiliate me in the process. That night, as I sat at my table, surrounded by people laughing at my expense, I decided his reign of arrogance would end. I hadn't walked into that reception unprepared. No, I knew better than to face Andrew without an arsenal. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, I had been quietly digging into his life. You see, Andrew had always been a little too smooth, a little too good at covering his tracks. He had a way of sliding through life without consequences. But everyone has secrets, and I was determined to uncover his. The first crack appeared when I reached out to Rachel, the private investigator. She didn't waste time. Within days, she had unearthed a trail of breadcrumbs that led straight to Andrew's past, one he'd worked very hard to keep buried. Turns out, Andrew had a long history of leaving destruction in his wake. There was the ex-girlfriend who had to move states to escape him after he blackmailed her with compromising photos. There was the small business he nearly bankrupted when he embezzled thousands from their accounts. And then there was the real estate scam, where he sold properties he didn't own, leaving countless victims in financial ruin. But that wasn't even the worst of it. Rachel found a former colleague of his who had been silenced with a non-disclosure agreement after Andrew sabotaged his career. Apparently, Andrew had stolen proprietary information, selling it to a competitor while his colleague took the fall. The man lost his job, his reputation, and nearly his family, all because of Andrew's greed. As damning as all that was, it wasn't enough to bring him down. Andrew was clever, always staying one step ahead of the law. But when I brought in an IT specialist, let's call him Greg, things got interesting. Greg managed to access some encrypted files on Andrew's personal computer. What he found was a goldmine. Andrew had been laundering money through shell companies for years. Fake invoices, offshore accounts, falsified tax documents. It was all there, neatly organized in folders labeled with ridiculous code names like vacation funds and retirement plan. Greg was able to trace the transactions back to Andrew's legitimate business, proving he had used his position to funnel millions into these accounts. And then there were the emails. Oh, the emails. Andrew had been corresponding with a man known for orchestrating elaborate Ponzi schemes. Their exchanges detailed plans for an upcoming scheme that would target retirees. People's life savings, wiped out with a few keystrokes. By the time I was done compiling all the evidence, I had a dossier thick enough to make the FBI salivate. But I didn't stop there. I wanted Andrew to feel the weight of his choices, to watch everything he'd built crumble in real time. So I tipped off the authorities, carefully timing my moves to coincide with his wedding day. As I sat in that reception hall, pretending to sip champagne and watching him revel in his own arrogance, I couldn't help but marvel at the irony. Here was a man who thought he was untouchable, who believed he could cheat, lie, and steal his way through life without ever facing the consequences. The guests had no idea what was coming. They laughed and danced, blissfully unaware that the man they were celebrating was about to be exposed as a fraud, a thief, and a criminal. Even Mary, sitting beside him with her smug smile, had no clue what kind of man she had married. The most satisfying part? Andrew had no clue either. He thought he had won, that he had bested me in every way. But as the night wore on and the authorities closed in, I knew his victory was about to turn into his downfall. A little flashback, guys. Before the wedding day arrived, every piece of my plan was in place. I wasn't leaving anything to chance, not with someone like Andrew. He'd spent his entire life dodging accountability, but not this time. This time, I would ensure his downfall was inevitable, methodical, and devastating. In the weeks leading up to the big day, I had been quietly working behind the scenes. After compiling the mountain of evidence against Andrew, his fraudulent businesses, embezzlement, and laundering schemes, I made sure it was all in the hands of the right authorities. The police, the IRS, and even a few journalists who specialized in high-profile financial crimes were in the loop. But I didn't stop there. I wanted to be sure they had more than just documents. I wanted them to have an airtight case. To seal the deal, I planted a tracker on Andrew's phone. It was easy, really. A simple device slipped into his phone case during one of his casual visits to my house months ago, before the affair came to light. At the time, I didn't even know I'd be using it for this purpose, but it was the best insurance policy I'd ever bought. The tracker logged his movements, recorded his calls, and even provided a record of his text messages. As the wedding day approached, I coordinated with the authorities. Timing was everything. I didn't want Andrew arrested quietly in the days leading up to the wedding. No, I wanted him exposed in the most public, humiliating way possible. On the day he thought would mark his ultimate victory over me. The morning of the wedding, I double-checked everything. The police had the evidence. The journalists were standing by, ready to report the scandal as soon as the news broke. My IT guy, Greg, was monitoring Andrew's online activity for any last-minute surprises. And me? I was practicing my poker face, preparing to walk into the lion's den without so much as a flicker of emotion. When I arrived at the venue, I was calm, even confident. I made my way through the crowd, greeting familiar faces and nodding politely at strangers. If anyone noticed how out of place I seemed, they didn't say anything. Most of them were too busy admiring the extravagance of the event, the lavish decorations, the expensive champagne, the live band playing soft jazz in the corner. Andrew and Mary were the center of attention, as they should have been. They floated around the room, laughing and toasting with their guests, oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Andrew spotted me at one point and gave me that insufferable smirk of his. I raised my glass in silent acknowledgement, my face betraying nothing. As the reception unfolded, I stayed in the background, waiting. Every now and then, I'd glance at my watch, mentally counting down the minutes. My heart was racing, but outwardly, I was the picture of composure. The toast was the perfect opportunity to record Andrew incriminating himself further. I discreetly started a recording on my phone, capturing every word as he mocked me in front of the entire room. His arrogance was astounding. He truly believed he was untouchable. When the toast ended, I excused myself and stepped outside. I called the lead detective on the case, giving him the green light. "They're ready for him," I said, my voice steady. "You know where to find him." I returned to the reception, blending back into the crowd as if nothing had happened. I watched Andrew, laughing and carefree, completely unaware of what was about to hit him. Mary, by his side, looked radiant, her laughter ringing out like a bell. I almost felt sorry for her, but only almost. She had made her choice. The trap was set. The authorities were on their way. As the minutes ticked by, I allowed myself a small smile. Let him have his moment, I thought. It'll make his fall all the more satisfying. Justice was coming, and it wasn't going to knock politely. It all happened so fast, yet somehow it felt like time slowed down, letting me savor every single moment. 1 second, Andrew was basking in the glow of his self-proclaimed victory, a glass of champagne in hand, surrounded by a sea of adoring guests. The next, the room was flooded with uniformed officers, their presence cutting through the jovial atmosphere like a knife. It started with a ripple, a hushed murmur spreading across the reception hall as people turned to see what was happening. Then came the unmistakable crackle of a police radio. The band stopped playing, mid-song, as the officers made their way through the crowd, their expressions stern and focused. "Andrew Johnson," one of the officers called out, his voice firm and commanding. For a split second, Andrew froze. I could see the flicker of confusion in his eyes, quickly replaced by something else. Fear. But he was too arrogant to let it show for long. With that signature smirk of his, he turned to the officer and said, "There must be some mistake. What's this about?" "There's no mistake," the officer replied, holding up a warrant. "Andrew Johnson, you're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering." Gasps echoed through the hall. Guests exchanged bewildered glances, their champagne glasses forgotten in their hands. Mary, standing beside Andrew in her pristine white gown, looked like she'd just been struck by lightning. Her face went pale, her lips trembling as she turned to him. "Andrew, what is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Andrew's charm failed him for the first time in his life. His smirk faltered, replaced by a veneer of panic as the officer stepped closer. "I don't know what this is about," he stammered, his voice rising. "Michael, did you do this?" He turned to me, his eyes narrowing with fury and desperation. I stood at the back of the room, calmly sipping my drink. "Me?" I said, raising an eyebrow. "Why would I? You've always been the one who's so good at winning, haven't you?" His jaw clenched as the realization dawned. He knew. Oh, he knew. But there was nothing he could do about it now. The officers grabbed his arms, their grip firm but not rough, and began reading him his rights. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As they cuffed him, Andrew's facade cracked completely. "This is a mistake," he yelled, struggling against the officers. "I didn't do anything wrong. Michael set me up. This is all him." The guests were frozen, their expressions a mixture of shock, confusion, and, in some cases, thinly veiled schadenfreude. A few whispered among themselves, piecing together fragments of the scandal that had just erupted in front of them. Mary, meanwhile, was rooted to the spot, tears streaming down her face. "Andrew, what's going on? Is this true?" she cried, her voice breaking. He didn't answer her. He couldn't. All his bravado had evaporated, leaving nothing but a scared, desperate man trying to wriggle his way out of a trap he'd spent years setting for himself. As the officers led him toward the exit, he craned his neck to look at me one last time. "You'll regret this, Michael," he spat. "You think you've won, but you're nothing without me." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The sight of him being dragged out of his own wedding in handcuffs was more satisfying than any retort I could have mustered. The room remained silent for a long moment after the doors closed behind him. Then, like a dam breaking, The murmurs turned into a cacophony of voices. Guests swarmed in clusters, speculating, gossiping, and trying to make sense of what they'd just witnessed. Mary collapsed into a chair, her hands covering her face as she sobbed uncontrollably. I didn't approach her. There was nothing to say. She had made her choice, and now she was seeing the man she had chosen for who he really was. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The justice, the poetic symmetry of it all. Andrew had tried to make me a footnote in his story, a man to be mocked and discarded. Instead, he had become the main character in a tale of his own downfall. As I walked out of the reception, leaving the chaos behind me, I felt lighter than I had in months. For the first time in a long time, I felt like myself again. Justice had been served, and Andrew's reign was over. I didn't expect to hear from Mary after the wedding. Part of me assumed she'd bury herself in the wreckage of her life, too ashamed to face me, too distraught over what had unfolded. But less than 24 hours after Andrew's arrest, my phone buzzed with her name on the screen. I hesitated before answering. What could she possibly want now? Closure? Forgiveness? A second chance? Whatever it was, I wasn't sure I was ready to hear it. But curiosity got the better of me, and I picked up. Michael. Her voice cracked, a fragile whisper of the woman she used to be. Can we talk? Please? Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her. Maybe I needed to hear what she had to say just as much as she needed to say it. We met at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, a place far from prying eyes and gossiping tongues. When she walked in, she looked like a shadow of herself. Her usual confidence was gone, replaced by a haggard expression and red-rimmed eyes. She sat across from me, wringing her hands as if trying to squeeze the right words out of them. I don't even know where to start, she began, her voice trembling. I made a mistake. A horrible mistake. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. Which one? I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But then I remembered the texts, the laughter at my expense, the betrayal that had gutted me. No, she didn't get to play the victim here. I thought I knew him, she said, her voice barely audible. Andrew, he was so charming, so convincing. I believed every word he said about you, about us. I thought you didn't care anymore, that you didn't see me the way he did. And you thought that justified everything you did? I asked, my voice steady but cold. She flinched as if I'd slapped her. Number, it doesn't. Nothing justifies what I did. I was selfish and blind, and I hurt you in ways I can't even begin to comprehend. I wanted to believe her, to accept her apology and move on, but the wounds were still too fresh. So why are you here, Mary? I asked, cutting to the chase. What do you want from me? Her tears spilled over and she wiped them away with shaky hands. I don't know, she admitted. I needed you to know how sorry I am. I needed to tell you face to face that I was wrong about everything. You didn't deserve any of this. I stared at her for a long moment, searching her face for sincerity. She looked broken, defeated, a far cry from the woman who had laughed at Andrew's cruel toast just days ago. Mary, I said, my voice softer now. I appreciate the apology, but it doesn't change what happened. You didn't just hurt me. You destroyed everything we had, and you did it for a man who didn't care about anyone but himself. She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. I know, and I'll have to live with that for the rest of my life. There was a long silence between us, filled only by the quiet clinking of cups and the murmur of distant conversations. Finally, she spoke again. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said. I need you to know that I regret everything. Every decision, every lie, every moment I chose him over you. I regret it all. Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. Maybe she needed to sit in the silence, to feel the weight of her choices without me trying to ease it. When she finally stood to leave, she paused, looking at me one last time. "You didn't deserve any of this, Michael," she repeated. "You're a good man. I hope you find someone who sees that." I watched her walk away, her figure shrinking into the distance until she disappeared completely. I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated. If anything, I felt a strange mix of pity and relief. Pity for the woman who had thrown everything away for a lie, and relief that I was no longer the one left picking up the pieces. Mary's regret was real, I could see that, but it didn't change the past. It didn't erase the betrayal or undo the damage. And it certainly didn't mean I had to carry her guilt alongside my own pain. As I left the cafe, I realized something. I didn't need her apology to move on. I had already started walking away from her the moment Andrew's handcuffs clicked shut. Her regret was hers to bear, not mine. And for the first time in months, I felt free. In the days that followed Andrew's dramatic arrest, life didn't return to normal. Because how could it? The fallout was swift and brutal. News of his crime spread like wildfire, plastered across headlines and whispered in every corner of our small community. He went from being the charismatic golden boy to a disgraced criminal in the blink of an eye. For Mary, the descent was just as rapid. Her perfect wedding had turned into a nightmare. Friends who had laughed and toasted alongside her at the reception now avoided her calls. The life she had built on Andrew's charm crumbled before her eyes, leaving her with nothing but regret and a tarnished reputation. I heard through the grapevine that she tried to visit him in jail. He refused to see her. Maybe he blamed her for not standing by him when the handcuffs clicked on. Or maybe he was too consumed by his own rage and shame to deal with her. Either way, their story was over before it had really begun. For me, though, life wasn't just about watching their destruction. It was about rebuilding my own. I'd spent too much time being defined by their betrayal, by the pain they'd caused me. Now it was time to take back my life, piece by piece. I started small. Cleaning out the house was cathartic in a way I hadn't anticipated. I boxed up the remnants of my marriage, every photo, every keepsake, every reminder of the life I thought I had. It hurt, of course, but with every box that left the house, I felt a little lighter. Work became my refuge. Throwing myself into my career gave me a sense of purpose, a distraction from the chaos. My coworkers noticed the change in me, and for the first time in months, their concerned glances turned into approving nods. But it wasn't just about work or moving on physically. I had to confront the emotional wreckage, too. Therapy helped. At first, I was reluctant. Admitting I needed help felt like another blow to my pride, another sign that I'd been broken. But the therapist didn't see me as a victim. She saw me as someone trying to rebuild. She helped me unpack the anger, the hurt, and the lingering guilt that maybe, just maybe, I could have done something differently. Through it all, I discovered something I hadn't expected: resilience. I wasn't just surviving. I was growing. The betrayal that had once defined me became a chapter in my story, not the whole book. Months turned into years, and with time, the shadows of Andrew and Mary faded. They became whispers in my past, not screams in my present. I heard Andrew had been sentenced to a long prison term. Apparently, the evidence I'd provided was enough to secure multiple charges. The judge had called him a manipulative, self-serving individual. And for the first time, I couldn't have agreed more. As for Mary, I rarely heard about her. She moved away, trying to escape the shame that clung to her. Part of me hoped she'd find peace someday, but another part of me didn't care. Her choices were hers to live with, just as mine were mine. Life moved on. I moved on. I found joy in small things again: a good book, a long walk, the laughter of friends who had stood by me through it all. Slowly, I opened myself up to the idea of love again. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't fast, but it was real. Looking back now, I can see how far I've come. That chapter of my life, as painful as it was, taught me something invaluable. I'm stronger than I ever gave myself credit for. Betrayal didn't destroy me. It refined me. It stripped away the illusions and left me with the truth of who I am. And that's someone worth fighting for. I'll never forget Andrew's smug smile or Mary's tearful regret. But I don't need to dwell on them anymore. They're just characters in a story that I've already closed the book on. My life is mine again. And for the first time in a long time, it feels good to live it. Justice was served, but more importantly, so was my freedom. And that's a toast I'll happily raise a glass to, any day.